Welcome to another episode of Coaching Uncaged. Today, I have the pleasure of being in dialogue with Simon Cavicchia. Simon and I have spoken a few times before. We've met a couple of times, and I'm always really excited about our conversations and where they're going to lead to. And today, we're going to start in one place and sort of explore where we go with it, I guess. And so one of the things that I've been wrestling with for a while is this idea around inclusion and diversity, and how do we have those conversations without creating blame and shame? Or how do we recognize that blame and shame might be in there, but we have to still stay in dialogue and in conversation with this stuff? Because this stuff can be difficult. But before we sort of dive into the depth of that conversation, it'd be great, Simon, if you could just maybe say a few words about yourself and the work that you do.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. These days, I work as an executive coach. I also teach quite a bit about coaching, particularly relational perspectives on coaching, and I also do some work in the field of leadership and leadership development. One of the things I'm very busy with in my own thinking at the moment is how executive coaching and leadership development can support leaders to go on thinking about the challenges that they face, not just in their organizations, but on a kind of whole planetary ecological level. And I also am a psychotherapist. I have a small clinical practice, and therapists and coaches know the value of supervision. And one of the ideas I've been playing with a friend and colleague of mine, Martin Vogel, is what might we learn from supervision as a practice, which is there to support professionals to manage complexity in their caseloads. What might we learn from supervision that we could apply to supervising leaders and to offering that regular reflective space where leaders can really pay attention to what it means to be leading in these very volatile and complex, uncertain times. So that's kind of where I am at the moment. So a bit of a mixed bag, but everything I do seems to support everything else. So
yeah, and I really am drawn to this idea of supervision for leaders, especially as we sort of look at this subject around sort of diversity, and how as leaders they are pushed to have that as part of their agenda. I say push, I don't know if push is the right word, but they're invited to have this as part of their agenda. And when I look at the sort of the leaders of the coaching industry, I question how much is it part of their agenda, because I don't see difference in the higher areas and levels of our industry within the organizations. And it makes me question, I wonder what supervision they might need, or supervisory support they might need, to kind of reflect on what are they doing and what are they not doing.
Yes, and I think, in your introduction, you were talking about what you've been thinking about, and how to stay around diversity and inclusion, how to stay in relationship when it gets difficult, not if it gets difficult. Let's just call a spade a spade. This is difficult, as you've been, and so I think the thing that supervision might offer in its early days is, supervision is seen as a relationship over time. We don't have 6 sessions of supervision and then think we are supervised. Supervision is already framed as an ongoing reflective practice for those of us who work in, you know, the messiness of human psychology, organizational psychology, human relating. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how the supervisory construct can act as a container to help leaders pay more attention to how they're being impacted by these really complex, challenging questions around, in this context, around inclusion and diversity. I mean, as you've been talking, I'm going to have to share this because it's such a strong association. I keep having these flashbacks, these very vivid memory of bonfire night, like, I don't know, circa 1970. My dad was Italian. He loved fireworks, but he was a bit of a rebel. And we went to an organized bonfire party, and everybody said, put your fireworks in the metal box. You know, there's some rules here. And my dad's like, no, mate, you're all right. I'll do my own thing. Anyway, cut a long story short, my dad left his box of fireworks open. A spark got in, the whole box went off. And I've got this memory of my mum diving from behind me with her coat and covering me with her coat until the show was over and we were all safe again. But I'm having that memory because I think talking about diversity and inclusion is like an open box of fireworks, just waiting for the little spark that's going to set the whole thing off. And that's what we have to guard against, is how do we create enough safety, psychological safety, and enough mutual engagement and curiosity and self and other awareness to keep the fireworks from exploding, so we can actually explore and move our understanding forward.
And as you say that, there's a part of me that goes, sometimes we need to let the fireworks off in agreement that when they're all up in the air and exploding, that together we will deal with what's happened.
Yeah, that's a lovely build on that initial association I had. Yes, yeah. It's like that's lovely. It's like fireworks are going to go off, but can the fireworks go off in a way that we don't literally have to dive for cover and run away from one another? Can we let them off and kind of learn and enjoy even the process of discovering together?
Because this sort of makes you think about, because coaching is all about discovery and it's all about uncovering. And I say it's all about, I'm sure all the coaches out there are going, oh, look at the language that Robert is using.
These generalizations that these two are making.
So if I stick with my generalizations for now, that when we talk about coaching as being that sort of about discovery and immersion and exploration and reflection, then how do we use our own coachingness to lean into these discussions so that we know fireworks may go off, but we're going to use the skills that we have to explore those fireworks.
Yeah. And I suppose what comes to mind as you say that is one of the principles that is really at the heart of a relational approach to coaching, as I see it, and it's particularly close to my heart. I don't expect people to agree with me, but this is how I'm declaring my hand. This is how I orient myself. Is that the person we are is the coach we are. So so coaching isn't just about, although this really has its place, it isn't just about learning very precise models and tools and skill and developing skills and frameworks, which is important, but ultimately the kind of one of the magical ingredients is who is the person of the practitioner. Because we don't split ourselves. Well, some people do, but I don't believe we can fully split ourselves into coach and person. Who we are percolates all the way through our practice as coaches. So I would be inclined to start with, what is the inner work that we might have to do as professionals who, by and large are passionate about what we do and can stand as a force for change in the world, if we so choose. We don't have to, but some of us think of coaching's possibilities in that area. What's the starting place? And for me, it's kind of starting with the self of the coach.
Yeah, I really agree with that. We train coaches. That's what we do. But in the training of coaches, one of the things I've always really held on to is that you are your own individual. And
Yes.
that's what makes you unique as a coach, because you will have a lens, a paradigm that only exists for you, that allows you to ask questions and to see things that nobody else can see. And by bringing yourself to this space, you are bringing yourself to the relationship that
Yes.
exists between you and your coachee. And I think when we don't bring ourselves, we're doing something else.
Yes.
We're holding back, we're putting the coat over one's head, as it were, and not allowing the real relationship to exist in the space.
Right. And I think it gets harder to bring more of ourselves to our relationships with our coaches. It's quite hard to start with for people who might maybe more used to a more sort of structured approach to coaching, to actually learn to use themselves as instruments with their clients. And it gets harder and harder to bring more of ourselves when we're in the territory of very challenging, very complex, very painful experiences around inclusion and exclusion. Because inclusion and exclusion, as I see it, go to the heart of what it means to be human. We are all fundamentally wired for connection, and we're all, as human beings, deeply, whether we know it or not, and whether we defend against it or not, deeply sensitive to the experience of feeling connected or not. And so when we're in the territory of diversity and inclusion, at a deeply psychological and developmental level, we're in the territory of connection, disconnection, and what that does to our species as human beings. The extreme vulnerability we can feel, and may well have felt many times in our early years and subsequently, the extreme sensitivity we have to feeling dropped, to being disappeared or othered, to being made invisible, to being judged as, on the basis of our differences, as flawed, as not welcome in a particular moment or group or society. This is profoundly personal, deeply delicate territory. And of course, what we're seeing on the world stage are all sorts of ways in which people defend against going there, through taking positions, through forming in and out crowds, through demonizing people who want to talk about this, the sort of the anti-woke brigade. The privileging of some kind of fantasy or ideal of free speech, which, as I see it, seems to boil down to free speech as long as it's on my terms. Because I could say more, but at the risk of being trolled, I might stop there for a second. See how this is landing with you.
Well, there's a couple of things that sort of jump out for me as you were saying that. So one of them was about this idea of being, as coaches, we learn our skill, and we then have to find our way to marry that skill with our sense of self or our identity. Yes. And I think that can be difficult, because we can get caught up with, am I doing this right?
Yes.
And we can get caught up with, the list of things that we're supposed to do as coaches. And it can take a time to shift from the learner as a coach to the practitioner, and then on to the mastery part of our coaching. And within that, there is we face these multiple points of vulnerability. And I guess there's something here for me about how do we as coaches stay vulnerable and contained? So it's like, how do we stay vulnerable and courageous? How do we lean into those difficult situations, opening up or opening our hearts, as it were, to that, but staying strong with our own conviction and our own sense of self?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. And I think that's in a way one of the dimensions of inner work that we might have to engage with, not just to become more integrated and more authentic as coaches, but also to be able to begin to tentatively inch our way into, with our clients, some of these huge questions, because we can't expect our clients to go anywhere that we're not prepared to go ourselves, which I really think, holds true for me. So I think that was a really brilliant framing. It's like, how can we befriend our vulnerability and find ways of bearing it, and being curious about it, and in that very capacity to be vulnerable and not defend against it comes enormous strength.
And that word there, sorry.
No, go on.
All right. When you said defend against it, because I think that's one of the challenges that we face when we start talking about difference, is we start to defend our opinion or our ideas because we feel shamed or embarrassed or attacked.
Yeah.
And in that defending, we lose the ability to be in dialogue.
Right. Because the minute or the moment we feel we have to defend, like you said, the possibility for dialogue in the sense of a fluid movement between two or many different people, of sharing a perspective and having somebody really hear that perspective and commit to wanting to understand that perspective, even if they hold a different perspective, and all of us being permeable to the possibility of changing our perspectives based on what we're hearing. That attitude is what supports dialogue, and that's how ideas evolve and new possibilities emerge. But if, because of our vulnerability, we resort to, and I'm not blaming anybody for this, psychoanalysts have understood for a long time that we defend against the things that we find painful or threatening. So it can't be helped, but it can be inquired into and engaged with. And the minute my supervisor uses this language, the minute we take a position, it is bound to be a conversation stopper. It might look like there are a lot of fireworks when people are taking, defending and attacking positions, but in terms of the emergence and the unfolding of a dialogue that is taking us somewhere new, that stops the minute people get into taking up positions and defending them. You can't go anywhere. It's a bit like a James Bond film, right? They're all the same plot, right? They don't actually end up with anything new, right? They start with the same goodies and baddies. There are a few switches along the way to make it exciting, and it ends up with exactly the same outcome. And that's potentially the risk with engaging with these huge questions about who we are as people and our universal vulnerability and humanity. The problem with getting into a fight about that is it doesn't actually create anything new.
This sort of swings me back to one of my first kind of volleys around this conversation in the coaching space, where It was just after the death, the murder of George Floyd, and there was the kind of resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And at Animas, we were going, okay, we've spoken internally a lot about this, but let's take that internal conversation out into the world. And one of my questions was, how do we take this conversation outside of ourselves without creating defensiveness in others? How do we talk about inclusion, diversity, and all of that difference, and bringing people together, and noticing when we're not doing that without people getting defensive? Because there are ways, I think, of having these conversations that invite people into the conversation, and there are ways of having the conversation that push people out. And how do I or we stay in the invite, especially when we have our blind spots and our unconscious bias and all of those, and our own humanness at play in this?
Yeah. It's really tricky. I mean, it's really tricky. And because of its trickiness, it's also potentially hugely fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, and it's so tricky because, well, I've got lots of thoughts sort of running through my mind. The first thing is, you know, your point about how do we perhaps well, not just in a professional capacity, but as human beings, how do we, who have, you know, opportunities to have these conversations with leaders and clients, and amongst ourselves as a profession, how do we create conditions that are more likely to support the dialogue I was talking about, and less likely to evoke position taking? So that's one dimension. And I think all of us interested in these questions and wanting to, however small, make some kind of positive contribution to furthering the conversation, have to think about how do we use our knowledge of human relationships and human beings and psychological safety and creating a container. How do we use all of that, deploy all of that in service of creating conditions for dialogue? The other side to that, which is, you know, is that, you know, as a white man with all the blind spots to privilege that I'm sure I still have, in spite of being interested in these questions for some time, you know, I can also really see how legitimate somebody who has experienced centuries of macroaggression and microaggression because of their ethnicity or because of their sex. I mean, you just look at the sort of the women's movement. I can also really understand the legitimacy of their outrage. So the trap here, I think, it's the trap that I've fallen into, is, you know, here I am working hard to create these conditions of safety, and people are still furious, and they're still furious at me. Oh, that's not nice. I like to think of myself as a nice person. And that's when I get defensive, or risk getting defensive. And, you know, if I'm being really honest, you know, defensive and maybe a bit resentful and a bit hurt that my best efforts at creating conditions haven't been fully respected. So, you know, the challenge here is, how do we create enough safety where people can also express their raw outrage? And be supported and be heard without people resorting to silence them, to shut them down, to defend, to contract away. And that's the real challenge. And we can get a bit, we can all get a bit omnipotent as coaches. You know, we think our methodologies and our psychological knowledge are profoundly valuable, and in many ways they are. But this territory is really, really complex. and tricky.
And I think there's, you spoke about this before, this idea of, the work starts with us, because as you were saying that, I was like, we create this condition to have a dialogue and we think it's going to be nice.
Yeah.
And the person that comes in to have the dialogue with us is carrying their rage, their anger into that space. And so that comes in. And so we get this thing that we weren't expecting because we were being nice as coaches or as humans.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's something about how do we be okay with somebody else's anger?
Yeah, somebody else's anger. And some people will be able to own that anger and will have a degree of awareness about it. Other people will be deeply wounded with good reason and seek to intimidate from a place of having been intimidated themselves. So it's this comes right back for me to our own personal work. Our own work around our own relationship to ourselves, to our own sense of self. And I know, when we were talking about this podcast, we were also thinking about the place of shame. And it won't be any surprise to you because it's one of my real interests and has been for years. But I think understanding the role of shame here and working with a constant vigilance around shame and shaming processes offers a lot in supporting the creation of these conditions. If somebody is furious based on their, legitimately furious based on their history, the narratives that have been constructed around them, their very deeply personal wounds around being marginalized. If I can't support myself not to collapse into my own shame, then I'm much more at risk of shutting down, withdrawing from connection, or out of conscious awareness for a lot of people, turning my own vulnerability in that moment into a counterattack. So I'm feeling a bit ashamed and exposed, and I'm going to shame you now as a way of defending against my own vulnerability.
I guess as I think about this from my position, I guess, I go, so what do I do? What do we do from a coaching perspective to begin to lean into this work? So, I look at Animas as an organization and I can see the work that we're doing internally to ask these questions of ourselves. And I can see the areas that we're moving towards. I go, yeah, look, we're creating inclusion in that space. But I also go, well, we don't have anybody like that in our space. I go, oh, that's interesting. How do we lean into that without just, going, let's have one of each. Let's do a pick and mix of one of each in the organization, because it's not about that. It's about the ability for somebody to choose to be part of the organization and there being a gateway for them to do that. I'm kind of jumping around in ideas here, but I think my foremost idea is, what's the work that we might begin to do to create a difference around this, especially when I think about the coaching industry and coaching bodies and coaching organizations. How do we begin to play our part in creating these containers for dialogue?
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting you have the answer there.
I don't have the answer, but and I think this is a life's work, and because it's very delicate and so complex. It's not always easy to see the impacts of our efforts in the short term, maybe even the medium to long term. But what we can do is we can look back and see how things have evolved. And, you could say at the surface of things, there is a lot more, well, there's a lot of attacking and defending that goes on around things like diversity and inclusion. There is also a lot of dialogue. There are some people who are very committed to creating conditions and containers for deeper, more psychologically attuned exploration of these questions. Organizations are taking steps to begin to address structural difficulties and imbalances. All of this, I think, is part of it. They're kind of they're drops that add up to a volume of energy over time. And I still think, going back to, and of course this is my bias, I still think ultimately what this boils down to for me is, what is the ongoing personal work that I have to do around my own relationship to people who I have been taught to see as very different to me, who I see as other to me because they are not part of a context or a culture that I'm more familiar with. It's like, unless I'm doing that work on an ongoing basis, I think we're limited in possibilities. And then we get sort of more sort of surface level change, but the fundamental depth change isn't happening. And the risk is that we see the surface change as evidence of change. But, in spite of race relations legislation and all sorts of structural changes, you talk to the experience of people who are cast as different or alien or othered. And at a deeply personal level, not a lot has changed, I don't think.
And what really jumped out for me, or struck me there, or resonated with me, should I say, was this idea of life's work. That it isn't something that happens overnight. We're caught in a society that desires the instant shift, change, gratification. This is a life's work. And when I think about it through that lens, there's also I guess, an easing in there, that the pressure to make something happen today is released, because I go, actually, it's going to take a lifetime to create this change.
Yes.
And being a droplet in that ocean is part of one's life's work, as opposed to trying to be the ocean or move the ocean.
Yes, and of course, if enough of us are doing our personal work and showing up in whatever sphere of control and influence we have, whether it's very small or large scale, we are making a profound contribution to the evolution of human consciousness around these questions. I mean, this has been a really hard lesson for me because, I for many years was in the grip of my own grandiosity and my own omnipotent fantasies of being able to change the world. And, with what's been happening in the US and in this country, from my perspective, feeling very powerless and very at the same time, very, really outraged and having fantasies of, challenging the whole kind of fake news, propagandist constructs that we're all being bombarded with. And, I even had this grandiose fantasy of, setting up a charity to teach critical reflection and critical awareness skills. And I caught myself thinking, oh God, that's a bit grand. Because actually what all of that was a defense against the deep feeling that I have of powerlessness, of my own deficiency and my own existential and very ordinary human limitations. But where I can make a difference is in how I show up when I'm paying for my shopping at the supermarket, in how I energetically relate to people I see when I'm on public transport, whenever I go back to public transport, as well as the leaders that I engage in these conversations with. If I'm really conscious of the need to be approaching every single encounter from as much presence and as much alignment with my values, my principles, then I am doing my work. And if enough people do their work, that will add up to something. And I have to watch that I don't get distracted into railing against, I've got a love-hate relationship with Twitter. I always, these days, well, there was a point last year when I felt like I was permanently one tweet away from a nervous breakdown, because I was so reactive. And I've been thinking, I think that's a bit seductive for me, and it's a bit of a distraction. I love indulging my self-righteousness and my indulging my moral high horseness, but actually that doesn't actually make a difference to anybody's lives. What makes a difference is being the change. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but living my life with my supervisees, with my husband, with my friends, with my family, with anybody I come into contact with, just trying to live in alignment with where I am now in terms of my core beliefs and values is the work.
Yeah, that so resonates for me, this idea of it starts with us, and it starts with how we are showing up and our ability to reflect upon that, and to know ourselves, to know when we are doing that thing that we do that we want to just kind of step back from or adjust with. And in that, we are the droplets that form that ocean that creates that change. Right. But also, when we're able to really be okay with ourselves, we can be part of those containers, because we're not fighting to get out or to explode. We're going, okay, how do we hold this? Yeah. And be okay with what's happening in this, to have this conversation. Yes. And be okay enough with myself to not feel attacked by you, even if you are attacking.
Right, absolutely. And this, I'm still very much a work in progress on this, because it's very challenging to the ego that we all can't help having until we've done a huge amount of work on ourselves to just relax it a little bit. But, in the spiritual school that I've been a student of for the best part of 17, 18 years now, one of the teachings, and it's an ongoing practice for me, is that the best defense is no defense. So when I have a reaction to something and I find myself getting defensive, I've been taught not to blame the other immediately for making me feel bad, which is what we can all get into, right? Because we're human. And, sometimes I manage it and sometimes I don't. But I know now that I can also look inside and go, oh, that's interesting. What am I doing to myself? What is this telling me? What is this reaction? What is this reactivity in me telling me about me? And then if I stay curious about that and, bring some compassion to that inquiry, then I can catch, that person getting angry really challenged my self-image of being a nice person who doesn't make people angry, because I think of myself as kind and compassionate. Well, clearly that isn't working for them right now. So get over yourself, Simon. Don't make it about you in the sense of, your ego, but make it about you in terms of, what's this pointing to in me that still needs to be ironed out? Well, I need to stop being overly identified with that particular image of myself. And then I've got more freedom to just be curious in about what's happening.
And you're saying that reminds me of a starting point in this conversation where you spoke about what can we learn from supervision to bring to our leaders to explore things in that ongoing reflective space. And I feel like that those questions that you're asking yourself very much sits in that space. And I guess there's a question for me around, is that container for dialogue is part of what enables that container to exist, those supervision skills that kind of hold and frame those conversations so that we're able to have those difficult conversations and difficult reflections, but work through them to come out the other side to explore what we might do next.
Right. And, sit with the disorientation that comes for us when we're challenged around something really, really complex and profound. And these kinds of developments in the human psyche and in human consciousness take time. And that's what I love about supervision as a construct, because it accepts that it's an ongoing requirement. For a number of professions, psychotherapy, coaching, it's seen to be something that it has a normative function. It's about establishing best practice and ethical practice. And last time I looked, I don't see an awful lot of leadership programs that teach about ethical leadership. There are more now than there ever were, but leadership isn't really being construed predominantly as a as being about a role of planetary and ecological and human stewardship. It tends to still be about the role, the business, the P&L, the bottom line. Nothing wrong with that. That's a construct. But, there's a lot now being written, both in economics, organizational theory, ecology, about our fundamental human interconnectedness and the need to be waking up to that reality, and that the impacts of our actions affect a much, and always have done, a much bigger landscape than we might have thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a whole another conversation in there around the impact of leadership that I think we can come back to at another date, because I can feel my brain spinning off around those ideas and what we might do with that. Simon, it's always fascinating and a pleasure having these conversations with you. I love how we sort of start in one place and bounce around and then loop back, and how it all kind of sort of just flows, but it also the richness of these conversations. I'm not sure if there's something that you would like to maybe say as part of a closing or a reflection of your thoughts around what we've explored today.
At the risk of sounding like a stuck record, you go inside as much as one might look outside. So really take seriously that the person we are is the practitioner that we are. And the work starts at home.
Lovely. And I think one of my takeaways from this conversation today is those conditions for dialogue, those conditions, those containers, and how I might play a part in creating those environments to enable this dialogue to continue.
Yeah, lovely.
As always, Simon, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure. I love just riffing like this and seeing where we go. It's anytime.